They dragged her from her home, fists and boots breaking more than just her bones, because she chose to love a man they called an enemy. While the fire swallowed her father's forge and her mother's hearth, he stood hidden in the trees, the warrior they feared, the lover they hated. She gasped through the smoke. "Wyatt, don't come back for me." But he did. He could have come back with fire and guns. Instead, he returned alone, carrying nothing but the truth, a truth sharp enough to slice through every lie they told. "If they burn our story, I'll carve it back into their hearts," he vowed. "This is not a tale of revenge. It's a promise that not even flames can erase." Sadie Quinn's breath caught in her throat as she pushed through the reeds, the river's muddy water lapping at her boots, cold enough to numb her ankles to the bone. Somewhere behind her, dogs barked, the sharp, ragged bark of animals who'd tasted blood. Men's voices cut through the dawn fog, rough with the mix of fear and anger that so often turned neighbors into hunters. She spotted him then, Wyatt Holloway, half submerged at the water's edge, his dark hair plastered to his forehead, blood curling downstream like ink in dirty washwater. His chest rose in shallow gasps, but his eyes were closed, lashes spiked with river spray. For a heartbeat, Sadie froze. She'd known him only as a rumor. "That Cheyenne scout," they hissed over sacks of flour and fence rails. But now he looked less like an enemy and more like a boy, someone's brother, someone once loved. The crunch of boots on gravel snapped her out of it. 4 men stood on the far bank, rifles raised. Lantern light glowed on familiar faces. Samuel Dobbs, who'd once brought her father whiskey on Christmas Eve. Old Mr. Tully, whose barn door she'd mended herself last winter. Now their eyes flickered like a wolf pack's, yellow with suspicion. She stepped into the open, muddy water, soaking her skirts to the thigh. Arms spread wide, breath shaking in the cold dawn, she planted herself between them and Wyatt's limp body. "Don't shoot!" she shouted, voice raw against the river's hush. "He's not your enemy." Dobbs spat into the grass, eyes narrowed. "Step aside, Sadie. That savage deserves—" "He's bleeding out," she snapped, "and you don't even know what really happened." A shot cracked the air. Not at her, not yet, but close enough that she flinched, ears ringing. Birds shrieked from the trees overhead. Her heart slammed in her chest. Behind her, Wyatt stirred, a broken groan slipping from his lips as if the gunshot had called him back from the edge. "Stay with me," she breathed, dropping to her knees in the sucking mud. She grabbed his arm, warm and slick with blood, and draped it over her shoulders. His weight nearly toppled her, but she gritted her teeth, bracing her boots deeper into the muck. Another shout. The men were circling downriver, searching for an easier shot. She felt their eyes like knives at her back. One step, another. Each dragged step through the reeds tore at her shawl, thorns lashing her skin. Wyatt half mumbled a word in Cheyenne, but it vanished in the wind. The cottonwoods rose ahead, dark and hunched like old sentries. Hidden beyond their trunks, the hunting shack waited. The same shack where she'd once hidden her books from the preacher's wife, where she'd memorized poems by candlelight while the forge at home cracked with her father's grief. The only place the village wouldn't search at dawn. "Almost there," she whispered to him, though she doubted he heard. Blood smeared across her collar, warm against the cold river air. Behind her, the dogs howled again. The men shouted her name, but she didn't look back. Sadie Quinn dragged the enemy they feared into the trees, and into the only part of the world that still felt like hers to protect. The forge had always been Sadie Quinn's real inheritance, not the battered house behind it or the thin plot of land out by the apple trees, but the iron heat that never quite let her forget who she was. As a child, she learned to hammer nails beside her father's broad shoulders, the air thick with smoke and the hiss of water cooling metal red as sunrise. Her mother, Ruth Quinn, had once sat by the window, mending shirts and humming songs older than the river. Sadie's earliest memory was of her mother's soft hands dusting soot off her cheek, whispering, "Hope can grow anywhere, Sadie girl, even where no one wants it to." But hope didn't keep Ruth alive when fever settled in her lungs. Sadie was only 10 when they buried her under the hawthorn tree, the same tree Caleb used to climb to make her laugh. Her brother Caleb was everything she wasn't, easy with his grin, always the first to help mend a neighbor's fence or lift a barrel onto a wagon. When the territorial guard rode through asking for volunteers to keep the settlement safe, Caleb never hesitated. He signed his name on a paper that meant nothing to the men who sent him to die on land they barely cared to understand. The day they buried his boots, the only part they got back, Sadie stood beside the forge's coals and swore she'd never believe a story just because it was convenient. Years passed and the village shrank in on itself. It was the same faces at the church each Sunday, the same tired nods at the well. But underneath, fear curdled everything. When cattle went missing, they blamed the Cheyenne. When fences were found slashed at dawn, they said the same. If the well tasted of rust, it was whispered that Cheyenne hands had poisoned it. But Sadie had read the town hall's hidden ledgers, yellowed pages crumbling like dry leaves. She traced the treaties with her calloused fingers, neat lines promising shared trails, fair trade, safe crossings. And when the ink turned sloppy, names scribbled over in hands that looked too shaky to trust, she wondered who really profited from neighbors tearing each other apart. Some nights, she heard the men meeting behind closed doors, their voices low and tight, planning how to protect what was theirs. They never said the words outright, but Sadie saw the way they looked at her when she carried iron nails into the market square, the way they flinched when her eyes met theirs. In her small room behind the forge, she'd sit cross-legged by the dying hearth. Caleb's old books spread around her knees. One page always found its way into her hands, the treaty that once promised peace if both sides kept faith. She'd read it by the light of coals, lips moving as if the words alone could hold the walls together. She knew better than anyone. Hope was stubborn, but fear could set anything to flame. And so she swore to herself then and there that when the lies started to crackle, she'd stand in the sparks alone if she had to. The hunting shack was never just a shed to Sadie Quinn. It was the only corner of the world that felt like hers before she even knew what freedom cost. Her grandfather had built it by hand when her father was still a boy. Rough cedar beams cut from the cottonwoods by the river bend. It was meant to be a place to teach his son to hunt deer through the lean months, to skin rabbits when the winters stretched too long for neighbors to spare a loaf of bread. After her mother died, Sadie found her way there alone. While her father hammered at the forge and the village whispered about the blacksmith girl who read too much, Sadie would slip through the underbrush with a book hidden under her shawl. She'd sit cross-legged on the creaking floorboards, her skirts dusted with pine needles, reading poems aloud to the wind. It was the only place no one told her to hush her questions or scold her for dreaming of a life beyond gossip and grief. On a beam above the small, shuttered window, her grandfather had carved a single wildflower, the petals rough but unmistakable. He'd told her father once, "Hope can root anywhere, even here, where the frost bites and the wolves prowl." Sadie ran her fingers over that carving every time she felt the village pressing in too tight. Now, as she drags Wyatt Holloway's battered body up the worn steps, she feels the same fierce pull of that memory. No one can watch her here. No one can twist her kindness into betrayal. Not yet. In this shack, hidden under the old wildflower's mark, she can choose trust over fear and silence over the poison of the village's lies. Inside the hunting shack, the air was damp with the smell of boiled water, scorched cloth, and the faint sweetness of dried herbs Sadie kept tied in little bundles. She'd found the battered kettle in a crate behind her father's forge years ago. The handle half broken, but sturdy enough to hold over the fire she coaxed to life on the shack's stone hearth. Wyatt Holloway lay on the old cot, his breathing uneven, each exhale catching like something stuck deep in his chest. In the half-light, his skin looked almost translucent where the fever burned through him, hair stuck to his brow in tangled strands. Sometimes he spoke in Cheyenne, half-formed words drifting like smoke into the rafters. Sadie couldn't catch their meaning, but the way he spoke them, soft, almost reverent, made them sound like prayers. She wiped his forehead with a rag soaked in the kettle's warm water. When she pressed her palm to his chest to feel his heartbeat, he stirred, eyes flickering open. Dark, wary, but too tired to hold any fight. His lips moved around words he struggled to shape. She leaned closer, hearing him rasp, "Why? Help me. His voice cracked, but the question was there, raw as an open wound. Sadie's answer came without a tremor. Because you're worth saving. She hadn't meant to say it out loud, but in this tiny space, with the wind hissing through the shutter and the river murmuring beyond the walls, there was nowhere for her honesty to hide. On the second night, when the fever broke for a while, Wyatt propped himself on an elbow, watching her twist new strips of linen torn from the hem of her petticoat. She handed him a cup of water, fingers brushing his knuckles, warm against the chill of his skin. A word formed on his lips, unsure, rough. Trust. He repeated it the way a child tests a stone for weight. Sadie's smile was small, but it cracked something open in her chest. Yes, trust. She tapped her own collarbone, then pointed to him. You? Trust. Me? Trust. She said the word again, slower until he mouthed it back to her. His eyes searched hers for the shape of the word's meaning, as if he needed more than just the sound. So he tapped his chest in return, then lifted a trembling hand to gesture toward the shack door, the world beyond them. In a voice made clumsy by pain and second language, he said a word she didn't know. Nakoe. She raised her eyebrows, urging him to say it again. He placed her hand flat over his ribs where the bandage wrapped tight. Home, he whispered, searching for the right English match. Then he traced a line on her palm with his fingertip. Slow, deliberate, until she understood. River. They sat like that for a while, their breath mingling in the cold glow of the dying fire. Outside, the wind rattled the shutters. Inside, trust, that fragile living thing, grew one word at a time. When her hand brushed his again to check the edge of the bandage, neither of them pulled away. It began as whispers over flour sacks and water buckets, the kind of talk that clings to rough hands and dry lips in a village that fears what it can't see. Sadie Quinn missed church 2 Sundays in a row, her pew left empty beside her father's weary frame. Someone said they saw her slipping down the deer trail behind the forge at dawn, skirts bundled under her arm, a bundle hidden under her shawl. Bandages, someone muttered. Tinctures. Mark my words, she's harboring one of them. Daniel Quinn was the one who saw it all. Her cousin, blood of her mother's line, once her best childhood playmate in the orchard. Now he watched her from the shadows, boots buried in frost-bitten grass while she disappeared into the cottonwoods. He waited until dusk bled purple across the sky, until the flicker of a lamp inside the hunting shack gave her away. He didn't see Wyatt's wound, or the way he slept fitful under blankets she'd sewn from scraps. He saw only shadows moving behind old timber and a story that would feed the village's hunger for blame. When Daniel spoke to the town elders, the words spread like dry grass catching a spark. Callum Quinn found himself surrounded one cold night. 4 men outside the forge where the anvil still rang with Sadie's hammer strikes. They spoke in tight, hushed threats, not for his ears but for his shame. She's consorting with the enemy, they told him. A savage in your father's shack? If you won't root it out, we will. What will people think of a blacksmith whose daughter betrays her own blood? Callum didn't answer them that night, but he turned away from Sadie when she came home, the rawness in his eyes saying what he couldn't bear to speak. She tried to explain. Words stumbled out of her mouth. Promises, the truth. But truth was heavier than iron. He let her sleep with the door bolted from the outside, telling himself it was to protect her. In his heart, he knew he'd already chosen fear. They came when the moon was high. Half the men Sadie had grown up knowing by name, torches in one hand, rope in the other. They broke down the forge door first. Callum tried to stand in the way, but one backhand sent him crashing into the anvil, the same iron he'd shaped into horseshoes for their wagons. They dragged Sadie out into the dirt yard. She kicked, spit blood, hissed curses through split lips, but boots and fists and rough hands forced her to her knees. She felt the sting of betrayal more than the blows, the sting of Daniel's eyes refusing to meet hers. Someone threw the first ember into the forge. Oil splashed across the timber. The flames took fast. The old dry beams, the shelves where Caleb's boots once sat, the tiny book of poems hidden under the hearthstone. The fire roared louder than her screams. Out in the trees, Wyatt Holloway watched, teeth clenched so tight they bled at the gums. He could charge down the hill, he could fight, But what would they do then? They'd hunt his people deeper into the hills, find reason for new blood to spill. So he crouched in the shadows, every muscle straining toward the girl who'd risked everything for him, and he swore that this fire would not be the end of them. In the dirt, flames reflecting in her eyes, Sadie tasted ash on her tongue as the only home she'd ever known collapsed into sparks and smoke. When Wyatt Holloway vanished into the plains that night, most of the village told themselves he'd run like any cornered animal. But Sadie Quinn knew better. She saw it in the way he looked back through the trees before the last ember of her family's home crackled out. A promise in the hard line of his jaw, a vow carved deeper than any scar. While the village rebuilt fences and spun new stories to comfort themselves, Wyatt crossed rivers that glittered under moonlight like veins of glass. He rode with traders, his arms still stiff where Sadie's stitches held the wound closed. He sat in firelit circles with elders from tribes once called allies, listening, asking, stitching scraps of rumor into a tapestry that made sense in a way no single lie ever did. Bit by bit, he found them. The names of men who profited when fear bloomed, who sold stories like poison in the preacher's ear. He found ledgers hidden under floorboards, torn pages traded for a skin of whiskey by a careless hand, a child's button pried from a stolen blanket, turned up in a trader's pocket 2 settlements west, a woman's silver brooch, bent and tarnished, that a crooked drover sold for a few dollars behind the saloon. When the first snow fell, Wyatt rode back into the village, not with a war party or raised weapons, but with a battered satchel across his chest, heavy with proof. The townsfolk watched him from behind curtains, doorways, frozen mid-step with firewood in their arms. They'd burned a house to cleanse themselves of guilt. Now the guilt came knocking. He knocked on doors one by one. A mother gasped when he pressed the child's button into her palm. A shopkeeper's wife wept when he laid the brooch on her table. He said little. He just looked each one in the eye, holding the silence until they understood. By the time he reached the square, people trailed him, heads lowered, lips moving in that uneasy hush of fear, crumbling into something harder to name. Sadie stood on the far edge, hair pulled back from her bruised cheek, her father's old coat draped over her shoulders like a shield. Wyatt faced them all, the satchel open at his feet, the pages and trinkets spread out like relics from a grave no one had wanted to dig. He spoke softly, but every word hit like a hammer on the old anvil in Sadie's burnt forge. If you burn one story, he said, voice steady, you feed another lie. That's what they counted on, that you'd be too afraid to look, too proud to listen. He looked at Sadie then, the only person who'd listened when it could have cost her everything. But the truth doesn't drown in ashes, he finished, his eyes sweeping over the faces that once spit his name like a curse. I kept it, and I brought it home. There were nights when Wyatt's hands trembled on the reins, not from cold, but from the echo of all the ways he could have made them pay. He pictured torches in his own people's fists, the walls of the village turned to cinders the way they'd done to Sadie's hearth. He could almost hear the crack of rifle fire, smell the panic he'd watched from the shadows that night they tore her from her home. But every time the rage swelled up like a storm in his chest, her voice pulled him back. The softness that lived in her, even when the world stripped everything else away. The way she looked at him when he was half dead, as if he was worth saving even then. He closes his eyes and sees her in that flicker of torchlight. Hair tangled, lips split, eyes burning with something fiercer than hate. Hope, somehow, still there. He knows if he lets hate answer hate, he becomes the lie they already tell about him. No more flames, he tells the wind. No more dead boys buried under false names. Let them see what they did, and let the truth stand taller than any fire they could light. It took weeks to gather enough good wood to replace what the fire had eaten away, but Sadie Quinn and Wyatt Holloway worked side by side until their hands blistered and the wild grass around the hunting shack was trampled flat under their boots. What once was a half-rotted hideaway tucked under the cottonwoods grew taller, stronger. Cedar beams pulled straight from the forest, a roof patched with bark and tar to keep the rain out this time. Inside, the hearth glowed warmer than before, not just with firewood, but with the quiet breath of something almost like hope. Sadie's battered kettle steamed over the coals, filling the corners with the scent of mint and pine. Wyatt tacked up bundles of dried herbs, sage for fevers, willow bark for pain. He mixed poultices in small clay bowls, showing Sadie which leaves to grind fine and which roots to boil slow. She wrote it all down in her careful, slanted hand, English letters dancing beside Cheyenne words she asked him to spell out, over and over, until she got them right. At first the villagers came only at night, a knock at the door, soft enough to be denied if gossip found its way to daylight. A mother with a baby's cough, a boy limping on a swollen ankle. They didn't meet Sadie's eyes, not at first, but they let Wyatt press warm paste onto bruised skin, let her whisper lines from old poems to calm their shivering children. The same mouths that once called her traitor now murmured, "Thank you," under their breath, each word as fragile as the trust that bound them there. Wyatt showed the children how to braid long grass into rope, their small fingers clumsy but eager. Sadie read to them by lantern glow, poems she'd once hidden under her cot, verses about wide plains and rivers that remember every name given to them. Sometimes when the children drifted to sleep on pelts near the fire, she'd glance up and catch Wyatt watching her. That same quiet wonder in his eyes that first night when she dragged him bleeding through the reeds. The shack was no longer just a shelter. It was a promise that no one had to stand alone on the edge of the woods, fists clenched around fear. Here, healing meant more than herbs or words. It meant a place where the people who once looked at each other as enemies could sit under one roof, warmed by the same flame they chose to keep alive together. It was the river that brought him to them, just as it had once carried Wyatt Holloway, broken but breathing, into Sadie Quinn's trembling hands. One stormy night, years after the shack had become a quiet refuge for those too afraid to knock on any other door, Sadie heard a sound in the wind that didn't belong. A baby's cry, thin but fierce, drifting through the hiss of rain on the cottonwoods. She found him wrapped in a frayed wool blanket, tucked against a root where the bank met the rushing dark water. He couldn't have been more than a few days old. She lifted him, wet and wailing, against her chest, and felt that tiny heartbeat thunder against her palm. So small, yet so certain. They named him Micah. In the nights that followed, the hunting shack's old walls held the warmth of lullabies whispered in two tongues. Wyatt taught him Cheyenne words for river, deer, trust. Sadie read him the same poem she once hid from the preacher's wife. Verses that spoke of home, of choosing love even when the world says you shouldn't. Micah grew strong on stories the village once tried to burn out of their people. He carried both her names and Wyatt's, both lines braided like the rope Wyatt had shown other children to weave from the tall grass. When people asked whose son he was, he'd answer proudly, "The river gave me to them, and they gave me a home." Years passed, and the hunting shack stood firm through blizzards, dry summers, and countless nights of soft knocks at the door. But a new threat rose. Not torches and fists, but a government plan pinned to a map in a distant office. A dam, a promise of cheap electricity that would swallow the bend in the river, drown the cottonwoods, bury the shack Sadie's grandfather built, and Wyatt rebuilt again with her. At first, the village was silent, just as it had been when Sadie dragged Wyatt from the reeds. But memory once lit refused to die quietly. Old men who'd once swung torches to tear her down now signed petitions with shaking hands. Mothers carried Micah on their hips to town meetings, telling officials, "This land holds more than your figures and lines. This land holds the promise they kept when we didn't." They didn't fight with guns or threats. They fought with memory, stories of a girl who chose trust over fear, a man who brought truth instead of revenge, a boy carried from the river who grew up knowing family could be chosen and held together by more than blood. In the end, the dam never came. Some say it was paperwork, some say it was luck. But those who remember know better. Some places carved by trust and held together by the stories people tell each other at dusk can outlive any river's reach. In the end, maybe this old story of Sadie Quinn, Wyatt Holloway, and a little shack by the river isn't so far away from the world we're living in today. We still see people turned into enemies because of fear. We still see families broken because someone was brave enough to choose kindness when it wasn't easy. And we still see small, forgotten places carrying memories that powerful people would rather drown out. Maybe the lesson is this: family isn't always who you're born to. It's who stays when the fire comes. And trust, once given, can rebuild more than a house in the woods. It can rebuild a whole community, piece by piece. So what do you think? Do you believe a story like this could happen today? Have you ever seen a moment when someone chose truth instead of revenge, or love instead of fear? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Share them in the comments below. Tell me what this story reminded you of in your own life, or what you'd hope to pass on to your children or grandchildren. Thank you for spending your time here, listening to a tale that reminds us all that some promises, the ones carved in memory, don't wash away so easily. If you enjoyed this, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and help keep these stories alive for the next generation. Until next time, may you find your river and guard it well.